This is the Veritas Podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Last week we covered paragraphs 14 and 15. Pius is continuing to talk about the modernists, and in this particular episode last week he was talking about those who fall into the era of pseudo-mysticism. We talked about the Catholic charismatic movement in this context. In this podcast, what we try to do, especially with this encyclical in particular, is read and discuss and give our commentary on what the Pope has talked about, but then apply it to actually what's going on in our age. And so we see a lot of the errors that Pius has warned about in our current age. So we're going to jump into it. But Rob, I believe at first you had some brief comments on paragraph 17, and then after he covers that, we'll jump right into paragraph 18.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make a comment on something he says at the end of paragraph 17. Pius X said, quote, "The modernists completely invert the parts, and of them may be applied the words of another predecessor of ours, Gregory IX, who addressed some words to theologians of his time." And then he quotes Gregory IX as saying this, quote, "Some of you, inflated like bladders with the spirit of vanity, strive by profane novelties to cross the boundaries fixed by the fathers, twisting the sense of the heavenly pages." And then he goes on to say that Gregory IX says that, quote, "They turn the head into the tail and force the queen to serve the handmaid," unquote. And this is exactly what the modernists do. This is a characteristic of modernism. They completely invert everything, just like Pius X said. When it comes to dogmas of the faith that have a practical application, like baptism or no salvation outside the church, they'll focus all attention on the possible exception, then they'll end by destroying the rule. And the end result is that no salvation outside the church becomes, like Pius XII said, it becomes a meaningless formula. And then baptism will become a meaningless sacrament because they'll focus on the possibility of baptism desire and then imply that everyone who's not baptized will be saved by baptism desire. So the end result is that they focus exclusively on the exception and they end by denying the rule. And they do the same thing with what we can call secondary truths while ignoring higher truths. And one example of this is the constant talk about the rights of man with no mention of God's rights, the rights of God, and man's corresponding duties. And the result of this distorted notion of man's rights ends by them claiming that man has a right to do what God forbids, such as practicing a false religion. The rights of man always need to be looked at, always need to be viewed in relation to the rights of God and man's corresponding duty. But by focusing exclusively on the rights of man, they end by denying the rights of God. Okay? And the same is true with moral issues. With moral issues, what they do is they focus exclusively on the subjective level, or the level of guilt or motives, which is a level that we're not supposed to judge. Then they completely ignore the objective level, which refers to the sinfulness of the act itself. And when someone speaks out against a particular sin, the modernists will claim they're judging the individual's guilt, even if the person doesn't refer to an individual, just to a particular sin. So they'll accuse them of being judgmental for speaking out against an objective sin. So they focus on the subjective and ignore the objective. And then when someone makes an objective judgment, they'll accuse them of making a subjective judgment. All right? And then we also see the same inversion when it comes to the mission of the church. The church's primary mission is to preach the gospel and to save souls. And then secondarily, the church should help the temporal needs of man, which it has always done through through the various religious orders. But for the modernists, they completely invert the order by focusing exclusively on the social side, on the so-called social gospel. And they end by turning the church into just a mere humanitarian institution which seeks the betterment of man's temporal life rather than the eternal salvation of the soul in the next life. And the result
Rob, temporal needs would be like food and shelter, social services.
Yeah, bodily needs in this life. That's a temporal order. And then they completely ignore the supernatural order and salvation of souls. And the result is that the supernatural is ignored, and then all the focus is directed just to the natural level, which is what we're seeing everywhere today. And in the book Liberalism is a Sin, Father Silvani discussed this point. This is how this is what he had to say about this particular error. He said, quote, "The liberal Catholic's appreciation of the Church has no foundation in its supernatural character. The Church does not address herself to his sympathies as a supernatural society whose first and supernatural end is the glory of God in the salvation of souls. It is on her social and human side that he regards her with affection. Our liberal Catholics are proclaiming the shadow while rejecting the substance. Forgetting the divine and supernatural character of the Church, they thus eviscerate the Church, making her the mere husk of what she really is. It is really not Catholicity, but mere naturalism, a pure rationalism. It is, in a word, paganism disguised in Catholic form using Catholic language," unquote. So we see this in all the different aspects. They invert the order. They focus on the lesser to the exclusion of the greater, and they end by destroying the greater.
As we go through Pascendi, there's obviously topics. 16 and 17, those paragraphs talked mostly about faith and science. We've discussed that before. Rob just concluded 17. We'll move on to paragraph 18, where Pius is talking about the conduct or the method of the modernists. In this paragraph, modernists regularly seem to contradict themselves, Pius says. And this is part of the problem that we see. You can't really pin them down. They're constantly contradicting themselves. But in reality, this is done on purpose, Pius says, to keep faith from being above science. They want the opposite. Modernists occasionally will state Catholic doctrine correctly one minute, but then the next they disagree with another dogma. Modernists do not like to talk about the divinity of Christ, as Rob was just talking about. They like to talk about the humanity of Christ. They're almost like social workers with a collar. We know that modernists love to talk about this humanity of Christ to make him more relatable and to subtly deny his divinity. We may hear this when people say the person of Christ is like this or that. They always say the person of Christ. Pius says that modernists also do not like church fathers, old councils, and that when they are confronted about this, they want to use the idea of freedom as a defense. Well, I have the freedom of thought, or I have the freedom to choose this or that. They don't want to be held down by dead old guys. Sometimes they even talk about it like that. And we're going to see that in a minute. Rob's going to come up with a couple of examples of this. We unfortunately see this, though, in an ever decreasing citation of old church fathers. The good, true doctors of the church, Aquinas, Augustine, are quoted less and less. Especially councils prior to the Second Vatican Council. We'll see that in modern texts from popes where they don't cite very much before about 62.
Right. Yeah, all they cite is Vatican II and the post-Vatican II popes. Very rarely are they going to cite anything pre-Vatican II. Now, a few comments on paragraph 18. Pius X said, the modernists, quote, feel no especial horror in treading in the footsteps of Luther, unquote, referring to Martin Luther. It's interesting to note that both John Paul II and Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, have publicly praised the arch-heretic Martin Luther. John Paul II did so on numerous occasions, On November 17th of 1980, during a visit to Germany, John Paul II visited a Lutheran church, and he actually gave a sermon at that church, and he spoke of the, quote, profound religious spirit of Luther. He then said to the Lutherans, quote, I come to you as the spiritual heritage of Martin Luther, unquote. And then 3 years later, he again visited another Lutheran church and said that Luther's case should be reopened and, as he said, quote, reconsidered in a more objective light, unquote. So is he accusing the church of not being objective when it condemned Luther's heresies? What else can you conclude? It needs to be reconsidered, he said, in a more objective light. So, and then
But Rob, as a clever modernist goes, you can't pin him down. Reconsider in a more objective light, but then a defender would say he didn't say that Luther was right and the church was wrong. Of course, he just doesn't state what all the other previous popes have stated before him, that Luther was a heretic, etc. But that's just more ambiguity, right?
Right. But there's not much ambiguity in, quote, I come to you as a spiritual heritage of Martin Luther, unquote. Martin Luther was an arch heretic who has been condemned, excommunicated by the church and condemned. So that's a difficult statement to twist. But he's not the only one. Ratzinger also had positive things to say about Luther. In his book, Principles of Catholic Theology, he said, this is Ratzinger said, quote, in the debate about what constitutes greater fidelity to the Church of the Fathers, Luther's historical instinct is clearly proving itself right. We are fairly certain today that, listen to this, we are fairly certain today that, while the Fathers were not Roman Catholic, as the 13th or 19th century would have us understand the term, they were nonetheless Catholic, and their Catholicism extended to the very canon of New Testament itself. So Ratzinger's claiming that the fathers of the church were Catholic, but not Roman Catholic, as understood by the church in the 13th and 19th century, and that Luther's idea of what constitutes greater fidelity to the fathers was correct, that's not a good statement. And then John Paul II tells a group of Lutherans that he's a spiritual heritage of Luther. This shows that what Pius X said about modernists is true, that they feel no horror in treading in the footsteps of Luther. Another point about paragraph 18 is that he says the modernists intend to blot out the old theology and replace it with what he calls a new theology. That's the term he uses, a new theology. Well, that is exactly what happened. And they even the modernists called their new theology the Nouvelle Theologie, which means new theology. Father Gary Lagrange, the great Thomist of the first half of the 20th century, he wrote an article in the 40s, I think it was 43. It was titled, Where is a New Theology Leading Us? And he concluded that it's leading right back to modernism. So Pius X said that the modernists want to throw out the old theology and replace it with a new theology. Well, sure enough, a new theology was introduced, and it was actually called the New Theology. It was condemned. Its proponents were condemned during the reign of Pius XII, but many of those proponents of the new theology then became the leading lights at Vatican II just 10 years after they weren't necessarily condemned, but they were held in some sort of ecclesiastical sanction. Many of the modernists were during the time of Pius XII, and then became the leading lights at Vatican II. And in the December 91 issue of 30 Days magazine, Father Henrici admitted, he said, quote, the Nouvelle Theologie, the new theology, has become the official theology of Vatican II, and indeed it has. The new theology is now the theology that you're going to find in the modern books of the theologians, von Balthasar, Ratzinger, all these modern theologians who are the proponents of the new theology are now cardinals, leaders in the church, and they're spreading their new theology, which has replaced the old theology and is undermining the faith itself.
Paragraph 19 of Pascendi. Pius is writing about the modernist as theologian, and this is building on his systematic way of approaching this. We've talked about the modernists in many different sections. In this, he's going to talk about the modernist principles. Modernists believe that man is God. Pius continues to pound this home. Pius has come back to this discussion of immanence. This allows man to do as he pleases, to make laws as he feels it necessary. If we all can recall, we've talked about the emotional needs of modernists. Pius talks about the public magisterium, which can be considered to a certain extent public opinion. Because of their anti-objectivity stance, it is hard to find one universal definition of their beliefs and their terms. Pius laments this when he says that the opinions of the modernists vary when it comes to God's relation to man. In the end, however, all the modernist opinions can be summarized as believing that man is God in some form or fashion.
Yep. In paragraph 19, he begins to discuss the modernist as theologian. We've talked about earlier how he discussed the modernist as philosopher, then the modernist as believer. Now he goes into the modernist as theologian. In paragraph 18, he said the modernists always place science above the faith, and by science he means the conclusion of scientists. So the conclusion of scientists, that is always placed above the faith. And then in paragraph 19, he said it's the job of the modernist as theologian to effect a reconciliation with faith and science, with the fallible conclusion of scientists, but always by placing science in a superior position. So the latest conclusion of scientists, that is almost like an article of faith, and then you have to reconcile what the church believes with that. So you have to distort or change or adapt the beliefs of the faith to the latest conclusion of the scientists. Once again, it's an inversion. The truths of the faith, those are infallible. The conclusions of scientists should be subject to and guided by the truths of revelation, not vice versa. But modernists, it's upside down like everything else. And he actually goes into that further in chapter or paragraph 21, further into how the modernist theologian tries to adapt the faith to the conclusion of scientists. But continuing on in paragraph 19, he explains what he calls theological immanence and theological symbolism. Theological immanence basically means that the divine comes from within man, that God is immanent in man. All right? And then what Pius X calls theological symbolism, that refers to man attempting to express in words the idea of the divine within. And these are symbols. He expresses in words the idea of the divine within, and he expresses them in symbols. So the formulas that man uses to express the ideas are what are called symbols. So modernists, they consider dogmatic formulas, meaning the actual wording of the dogmas. They consider that to be mere symbols that man uses to express his own ideas. You see? So according to the modernists, dogmatic formulas, they're not immutable truths revealed by God and defined by the church, but instead they're just man's attempt to express the truth of his own consciousness, but, as Pius X says, without ever succeeding in doing so. They're an inadequate expression of the truth. And he says that since they're an inadequate expression of the truth, he said the modernists claim we shouldn't place too much emphasis on them. So dogmas to a modernist, it's not a truth revealed by God that we have to adhere to with faith. intellectually adhere to by faith. Instead, the dogmas, they consider them just something that man, a symbol that man uses to express what he feels within. That's all it is. And then when man starts to feel different, well, he needs to change those symbols to correspond to his new feelings. So, according to the modernists, these formulas, they're only there to help man express what he believes at a particular time. They're an expression of the common consciousness of man, because the modernists, they think that dogmas, it's just the common consciousness of the people at a particular time. The common consciousness comes together, everyone's in agreement on something, and so the magisterium then gives the stamp of approval, and it becomes a dogma. And that's a symbol expressing what they believe at the time. But when the common consciousness changes, so too will the symbols or dogmas change. That's what the modernists believe. And so Pius then said about this, he said, quote, "These errors are truly of the gravest kind, and the pernicious character is seen by an examination of their consequences," unquote. Well, the consequences of this particular error is that all dogmas, every single dogma, is undermined, because the idea of dogma itself is undermined. So that means all the dogmas are undermined. And that's why modernism is more than just a heresy. Heresy denies one or more dogmas of the faith. But modernism undermines all dogmas by claiming that the dogmas are just an inadequate expression of the truth of man's consciousness at a particular time. So they completely undermine the faith by undermining the very idea of dogma.
And before I move forward to probably our last paragraph, as I was listening to you, Rob, you're talking about not science, but the conclusions of science. I think it's a really important distinction because, as Pius has talked about in other popes, science and faith are not in a battle. They don't contradict themselves, but the scientists a lot of times do. Just to think of some of the things that the scientists have gotten wrong, or they change from one week to the next. It'd be an endless list, but I remember several years ago they talked about how much water to drink, and they've changed that. Milk was good for you. Now they don't want you to drink so much milk, and so forth. Global warming, no, it's global cooling. Right. What a planet is. Pluto is no longer a planet, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the whole point is that these scientists are propped up by their colleagues, but also now by society, by the media, as this magisterium. In other words, this divine, so to speak, authority, that whatever scientists say is now true. Evolution, of course, is considered kind of dogma and law as opposed to a theory, that sort of thing. But they're constantly changing. In the next 5 years, what will they now say that they originally got wrong? Are vitamins good for you or not? Should pregnant women, eat this or not? And so it's constantly changing, as their philosophy does.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go on and jump into paragraph 20, which will probably be our last one for this episode. Pius continues this discussion, and part of the problem when dealing with these modernists is that facts don't matter to them. If we are divine, as modernists propose, then we as man cannot be wrong. You're right, I am right, we're all right, and it doesn't matter what time you were right. So in the 1950s, if the scientists were right that Pluto was a planet, they can also be right in 2014 that Pluto is no longer a planet. Modernists believe in this divine permanence, and that's a key word that Pius talks about. Modernists create their own magisterium from their own fathers, who we've talked about, and then they build this faith upon these fathers of modernism. Just think of some of the prominent atheists, agnostics, these scientists. Modernists love to talk about them. They love to cite them. And you can tell who a modernist is by what and who he cites. They believe that those like them are God, and this results in this permanent immanence from which they work off of. And Rob is going to explain a little bit of this as well. This immanence, though, creates barriers to all things Catholic. Pius continues this discussion when he says that modernists do not believe Christ had divine knowledge from all time, because this would make him not like them, because their intellect is formed over time and through degrees. But if Christ was different from them, then they are not God. This leads them to believe that the church and her sacraments were not instituted by a divine Christ. This happens because modernists believe in an evolution of ideas and of dogma, as we've discussed in previous episodes. Because man is God, they say, the beliefs are slowly added to and amended over a period of time. This belief allows them to continue to add or subtract from the faith in the future. We talk about the living document of the Constitution. That's what liberals say, and political conservatives say it's not a living document. Well, when we're talking about modernists, everything is living. In other words, everything is open to change. Rob, let's hear your comments.
Yeah. I want to comment briefly on the church and the sacraments, how the modernists believe they came into being. Like you mentioned, they deny that Christ personally instituted the church and the sacraments. What they say is that they were instituted mediately or indirectly by Christ, but he didn't actually found the church and establish the seven sacraments. He just did so indirectly, and this is how they explain it. They say that the Christian consciousness, the consciousness of all Christians, were virtually contained within the consciousness of Christ, as a branch is virtually contained within a seed. Okay? Now, since the life of Christ was divine, so too, they say, is the life of the Christian. And it's this divine life of Christ that's contained within the Christians that produced the church and the sacraments at a later time. You see, so Christ was divine. Well, his consciousness is also contained within the Christians. Well, that means the divine life of Christ also is passed on to the Christians. So the later Christians started the church and the sacraments, but they did so by virtue of the divine life they got from Christ. That's how they explain it. So by this, they deny that Christ founded the church and instituted the sacraments. All right? Now, another thing, they say that just as they say that dogma is simply a formula that man comes up with in an attempt to express the thoughts of his consciousness, okay? In the same way, they say that sacraments are something that man came up with, material things man came up with, that help him to give a sensible expression to his inner feelings. Okay? So dogmas are a intellectual articulation of what he feels inside. Okay? Well, the sacraments, they're a material, sensible sign of his inner feeling. Okay? So the sacraments, they're just there to help us express our religious sense, they would say, in a tangible way. So if you can see what this does, instead of the sacraments being instituted by Christ and communicating the grace that they signify, they're just looked at as something that man came up with to satisfy the inner need he has to express his religion. This is what Pius X said. Yeah, you have something to say?
Well, I was just going to cut you off. That's a really good point. Well, we're going to lead into the sacraments and Scripture and Church in our next episode, but you had a quick comment?
Yeah, I want to just quote what he says about this in chapter 21. He said, quote, this is regarding the relation between, like I mentioned, the dogmas and the sacraments. What is what Pius X said? Quote, what the phrases are to the ideas, that the sacraments are to the religious sentiment, and that nothing more. And then Pius X goes on to say, quote, the modernists will be speaking more clearly were they to affirm that the sacraments are instituted solely to foster the faith. But this is condemned by the Council of Trent, which says, quote, if anyone say that the sacraments are instituted solely to foster the faith, let him be anathema, unquote. So basically what he's saying there If that is what the modernists say, they just won't use those words because that's been officially anathematized at the Council of Trent.
All right, well, let's go on and end there. In our next episode, we'll cover paragraphs 21 through 23 in a little more depth. That's the sacraments, scripture, and church he talks about. So if you're following along, I'd encourage you to read ahead. I appreciate it. Rob, take care.